The Backwoods general who turned militia into killers. How Daniel Morgan shattered the British at Cowpens. This is not a story about tactics. Not really. The tale everyone tells about Cowpens focuses on the double envelopment, the militia feint, the cavalry charge, the chess pieces moving on the board. But here is what nobody talks about. The real secret was something far darker, something Morgan discovered about how fear works in men who should not be soldiers at all. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand the single most important principle that separates commanders who break armies from commanders who watch their men scatter like startled birds. Stay with me, because I am going to reveal exactly how Morgan weaponized the one thing British officers believed their enemy could never do. That is the insight that changes everything. If you have lived through anything like a Cold War childhood, if you understand why your grandfather never talked about Korea, then you already know this. History does not write the names of men who understood people. It writes the names of men who won. Morgan did both. But first, I have to ask you something. If you have ever watched a documentary on the Southern Campaign and thought something was missing, comment below and tell me what bothered you about those stories. That kind of feedback helps us find the angles that history forgot. Hold on. Before we go any deeper into what happened at Cowpens, I need you to know something about how we are covering this. Our complete guide on military deception and the psychology of morale is available in the description and pinned in the comments below. It is where we unpack the mechanisms behind how commanders manipulate fear instead of fighting it. The keys to understanding Morgan are all there, explained in detail. This video is the story. The guide is where you learn the architecture. South Carolina in January 1781 was a graveyard for American hope. Charleston had fallen the previous May. General Clinton controlled the ports, Cornwallis controlled the interior, and everywhere across the backcountry, British cavalry and loyalist militia were hunting patriots like foxes hunt rabbits. The Continental Army in the South had been shattered at Camden, not defeated, destroyed. General Gates fled the battlefield on horseback. 2,000 American soldiers ran. The rest were captured or killed. When Washington finally sent General Nathanael Greene to salvage what was left of the Southern campaign, Greene arrived to find fewer than 1,500 men who could still hold a musket. Greene was a Quaker, a man of peace by faith and training, but he was also the only officer Washington could send who understood something critical about warfare that most generals at that time refused to accept. Losing battles does not automatically mean losing wars. Sometimes, losing strategically is the path to survival. This is where most histories of Cowpens begin to get the story wrong. They focus on Morgan as the clever tactician, the backwoods schemer who outfoxed the British at a cattle meadow. But the truth is stranger and more profound. Greene made a decision that his own officers thought was madness. He split his tiny, starving army into two separate commands. One force remained under Greene. The other, roughly 600 men, went west under Daniel Morgan's command. Why would a commander voluntarily cut his already fragile army in half? Because Greene understood the British did not fear armies, they feared uncertainty. By splitting his force, Greene made Cornwallis choose: pursue one army and leave the other free to strike his supply lines, or divide his own force and risk being beaten in detail. Cornwallis chose to pursue Morgan. And this is where Morgan's true genius begins to emerge, but not the way the history books tell it. Most histories say Morgan set up the perfect trap at Cowpens. That makes him sound like he was clairvoyant, like he somehow knew exactly where Tarleton would attack and when. That is not what happened. Morgan did not design the Cowpens position as a masterpiece. He designed it as a desperate survival play. He expected to lose men. He expected to retreat. He expected, actually, to be defeated. What Morgan understood that his opponents did not, and this is the part that changes everything, was that militia are not regular soldiers. They are farmers, merchants, backwoods hunters, and trade workers who picked up a musket because their homes were being burned and their families threatened. The British officer corps treated militia with contempt. They were viewed as undisciplined rabble, men without the stomach for real warfare. Morgan did not see it that way. He saw militia as men with something to fight for: land, family, freedom in their own valley. That mattered. It mattered more than drill formations and parade ground precision. At Camden, militia had panicked and fled because they were asked to do something impossible: to stand in an open field and exchange musket volleys with professional soldiers from Britain's elite regiments. The British had superior training, superior discipline, superior everything when it came to that kind of formal warfare, and the militia knew it. Their confidence was shattered before the battle even began. Morgan studied that disaster the way a surgeon studies a wound to understand how it got infected. He realized something dangerous. Militia did not fail because they were cowards. They failed because they were asked to do something that contradicted their nature. A backwoods rifleman is a creature of the tree line. His power comes from cover, from distance, from the ability to aim and choose his shot. You take that same rifleman and put him in an open field where he is shoulder to shoulder with men he barely knows, where officers are screaming orders and British cannon fire is tearing holes in the line. You are asking him to be something he is not. You are asking him to be a Prussian drill master's creation, instead of the thing that actually makes him lethal. And this is when Morgan's genius became something more dangerous than simple tactics. It became psychology. Morgan decided he would not ask his militia to do what they could not do. Instead, he would ask them to do exactly what they were best at. This sounds obvious now, but in 1781, it was revolutionary. He told his militia units, and this is documented in multiple sources, he told them they would not be expected to hold a line. They would not be expected to die in a formation. Instead, they would fire 2 volleys from positions of their choosing, on terrain that favored rifle fire, and then they would retreat. Let me repeat that because it is the part that almost no one understands. Morgan told his militia they would retreat. He ordered them to run. He told them that running away was the plan, not the shame of battle. This is not a small thing. Every ounce of military tradition, every code of honor in 18th century warfare said that retreat was defeat, that running was cowardice, that a soldier who abandoned his position was guilty of mutiny. Morgan threw all of that out the window. He said, "You are going to fire twice, and then you are going to run to the second line, and that is victory. That is exactly what I want you to do." That single order changed everything, because Morgan had just told his militia something that British officers never would have imagined. You are not going to die today. You are not going to stand and watch your friends cut down by bayonets because you are outnumbered and outmatched. You will fire, you will move, and you will live. That promise removed the fear that had destroyed them at Camden. And once the fear was removed, something unexpected happened. They became killers. When Morgan spoke to his assembled troops the night before Cowpens, he did not give them a rousing patriotic speech about liberty and the cause of America. He gave them something far more powerful. He gave them information. He explained the ground to them. He explained exactly where they would fire. He explained where they would retreat to. He explained how the second line would be positioned and how cavalry would be waiting for exactly the right moment. He treated them like participants in a plan, not cannon fodder in a grand design. This is the kind of detail that separates competent commanders from truly dangerous ones. A competent commander tells you where to stand and what to do. A dangerous commander tells you why. He makes you understand the larger design so that even when chaos erupts, and it always erupts, you are not just following orders blindly. You are participating in something larger than your own survival. You are executing a plan that makes sense. That is what Morgan gave his men. Not just a battle plan, but a stake in its success. They were not passive pieces on a chessboard. They were architects of their own victory. Transition marker for Part 2. The morning of January 17th arrived cold and gray across the South Carolina backcountry. Morgan's men stirred before first light, moving into positions he had chosen with the precision of a man who had spent months studying this exact ground. The Cowpens was no accident. It was not simply a place where 2 armies happened to collide. It was a stage that Morgan had selected and prepared, knowing exactly how the British would move across it, knowing how his own men would respond, knowing what fear would drive Tarleton to do when he saw American soldiers waiting. Morgan positioned his force in 3 distinct layers, each one serving a purpose that his men now understood completely. The first line, closest to the approaching British, consisted of his militia, the very soldiers that conventional military doctrine said would break and run. Morgan placed them at the edge of a gentle rise, with clear ground behind them for retreat if needed. This was crucial. He was not asking them to stand and die. He was giving them permission to run, which paradoxically made them more likely to stand. The second line, positioned roughly 150 yards behind the first, held his Continentals, the trained regulars, the men who could hold formation under fire. Cavalry-mounted scouts had been positioned to the flanks and rear, out of sight but ready to move. This layering, this architecture of the battlefield was not theoretical for Morgan. He had lived through Camden, where militia fled and British cavalry hunted them down in open ground, slaughtering hundreds who had nowhere to retreat to. Morgan was going to give his militia an escape route that was actually a trap. Between the militia line and the Continental line, Morgan had positioned his sharpshooters, men with rifles, not muskets, capable of picking targets at distances that smoothbore muskets could not reach. These were the hunters, the men from the Appalachian frontier who had learned to shoot from necessity, not from a parade ground. Every shot they fired was meant to wound or kill a specific man, not to create a noise and a puff of smoke like a volley from massed muskets. As the sun rose higher and the mist began to lift, Morgan moved along the lines one final time. The men recognized him. They had seen him before, at Saratoga, in the wilderness, fighting the same enemy they now faced. One witness who was there that morning recorded that Morgan appeared calm, even serene, as if he was about to conduct an inspection rather than defend his force against an army of professional soldiers. Morgan's final instruction to the militia was the kind of simple clarity that separated him from lesser commanders. He told them, fire 2 volleys and then retreat. 2 volleys. That was all he asked. Not stand forever. Not trade shot for shot with British regulars. Just 2 volleys. Enough to hurt the enemy, enough to shake his confidence, enough to make the British believe they were winning, and then run. Run behind the Continental line. Run to the cavalry position. Run to safety. 2 volleys was the entire extent of their responsibility. This is the moment where understanding the psychology of untrained men becomes a military genius. The militia at Cowpens were not told they were cowards. They were not told they were defending a position to the last man. They were told something far more powerful. You have a job, it is achievable, and then you have an escape route. There is no shame in retreat if the retreat is part of the plan. There is no failure in running if running is what you were ordered to do. The British were coming. Around mid-morning, scouts confirmed it. Banastre Tarleton had caught Morgan's trail and was moving toward the Cowpens with overwhelming confidence. Tarleton was a man in a hurry. He had young soldiers, fresh from Europe, equipped with bayonets and disciplined formations. He believed that Americans, especially militia, would break at the sight of a British cavalry charge. History had taught him this. Camden had taught him this. He expected victory in minutes. What Tarleton did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was advancing into a perfectly laid trap. Every step his army took was moving him exactly where Morgan wanted him to move. Every confident decision he made was the decision Morgan had predicted he would make. Every standard tactic from the European military handbook was leading him toward a catastrophe that would shatter his reputation and shake British confidence in the South. Before we continue, this is where the deeper layers of Morgan's tactical genius become visible, and I want to be very clear about something. The difference between a lucky victory and a masterfully executed battle plan lies in understanding the opponent's psychology, not just his tactics. That is why I have created a complete tactical breakdown guide on the precise movements, counterattacks, and decision points that determine the outcome at Cowpens. It is available in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. This ebook contains the full mechanisms of how Morgan predicted Tarleton's every move and positioned his forces to exploit those predictions. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and how Morgan saw 3 moves ahead of his enemy, you will find that in the guide. But let us continue with what unfolded on that frozen meadow. The British skirmishers appeared first, light infantry moving ahead of the main force, feeling out the American position, testing the ground. They exchanged fire with Morgan's riflemen, who immediately began to inflict casualties at distances the British could not effectively return fire. This was the beginning, not the main assault, but already Tarleton's careful plan was showing cracks. He had expected to find American militia scattered across the Cowpens, running in disorder. Instead, he found a disciplined force positioned with deliberate purpose. Tarleton made his next decision, the decision Morgan knew he would make. Faced with disciplined resistance, and believing that the longer he delayed, the more Americans he would lose, Tarleton ordered his main force forward. The British regulars began their advance across the open meadow, moving in formation, their discipline and training evident in every step. They were moving uphill, toward the American militia. They were moving exactly where Morgan wanted them to move. The distance closed. 100 yards. 50 yards. The American militia waited, muskets ready, hands steady. They knew their job. 2 volleys. That was all. 2 volleys and retreat. Morgan had made sure they understood, had made sure they believed they could do this. And now, as the Scarlet Line approached, they would prove whether they believed in themselves. The first volley from the American militia line erupted at close range. The effect was devastating. British soldiers fell, gaps appeared in the disciplined line. But the British returned fire, and now the noise was tremendous. The crack of hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously, the smoke rolling across the meadow, the screams of wounded men. This was the moment where untrained militia traditionally fled, panic-stricken, running in all directions. But Morgan's militia did not run in panic. They held their ground, fired their second volley, watching more British soldiers fall, and then, on command, they turned and moved to the rear in good order. This was not a rout. This was a tactical retreat, a planned movement, exactly as they had been instructed. And it was this moment that began to unravel everything Tarleton had planned. Seeing the American militia fall back, Tarleton believed he was winning. He believed the Americans were breaking, fleeing in disorder, exactly as they had at Camden. He ordered his force to pursue, to press the advantage, to drive the wedge deeper. His cavalry charged after the retreating militia, their horses thundering across the frozen ground, their sabers raised. It was the natural decision, the traditional response to a breaking enemy. It was also the moment when Tarleton walked directly into the trap. The retreating militia did not scatter and die in the open, as had happened at Camden. They did not flee toward the rear without organization or discipline. They ran toward the Continental line, and as they reached it, the Continentals opened their ranks to receive them. The militia passed through the lines of the regulars and moved to the rear, exactly as Morgan had planned. And in that moment, the British cavalry found itself facing not a broken army in flight, but the disciplined regulars of the Continental Army, standing in formation, muskets loaded and ready. What happened next was tactical devastation. The Continental line fired a massed volley directly into the British cavalry charge at close range. The effect was catastrophic. Horses fell, throwing their riders. Men screamed. The charge that Tarleton had believed would shatter the American force instead broke itself against the disciplined formation of Morgan's regulars. The cavalry scattered, reformed, and charged again, and again met the same withering fire. The British cavalry, elite and professional, discovered that their advantage meant nothing against an enemy that would not break. Meanwhile, the British infantry, moving forward to support the cavalry charge, had become somewhat disorganized in their pursuit. They had not closed their ranks properly. They had not maintained their disciplined formations. They had believed themselves to be chasing a broken enemy, and in doing so, they had lost the one advantage they possessed over Morgan's men: the discipline and training that European military formations required. Morgan's cavalry, which had been held in reserve throughout the entire engagement, now struck. They emerged from behind the ridge where they had been waiting, moving at speed toward the scattered British formations. Morgan had planned this moment precisely. He had told his cavalry commander, Colonel Washington, exactly when to move, and Washington had waited with the discipline of a man who understood that timing was everything. The cavalry appeared not where the British expected it, but where it would cause maximum disruption. The battle, which had seemed to be a close contest only minutes before, suddenly transformed. Surrounded on multiple sides, disorganized and shocked by the appearance of American cavalry they had not anticipated, the British formations began to collapse. Tarleton, seeing his carefully organized force unraveling, made the decision to withdraw. The British army, which had arrived at the Cowpens confident in overwhelming victory, departed in defeat, leaving behind hundreds of casualties and the shattered confidence that had sustained their southern campaign. Within 1 hour, the battle was over. The British had suffered over 400 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties were fewer than 80. Tarleton's force, supposed to be among the most professional in the British army, had been annihilated by men who were, by traditional military measures, supposed to be inferior in every way. The militia had not run at the sight of British bayonets. The Continentals had not broken under cavalry charges. The cavalry had not appeared where Tarleton expected them. Every element of Morgan's plan had functioned exactly as he had designed it. But the significance of Cowpens extended far beyond a single victory. Morgan had accomplished something that few commanders in the Revolution had managed. He had defeated a professional British force decisively and quickly, without heavy losses to his own men. More importantly, he had proven something that needed to be proven in the southern colonies at that moment. He had proven that American militia, when properly led and positioned, could stand against British regulars. He had proven that tactical genius could overcome numerical disadvantage and professional training. News of the victory spread through the South like fire through dry grass. Militia recruitment increased. Patriot confidence recovered. Loyalists, who had believed the British army was unbeatable, began to question whether loyalty to the crown was the winning side. The strategic consequences of 1 hour of combat at the Cowpens rippled across the southern campaign. Within a few months, Cornwallis would begin his retreat toward Yorktown, toward the final defeat that would end the British hope of winning the war. This is the secret that I promised you at the beginning. The reason Morgan's victory mattered so deeply was not simply because he won a battle, but because he understood that battles are not won by courage alone, or by professional training alone, or by numerical advantage alone. Battles are won by the commander who understands his enemy's psychology, who knows what his own men are actually capable of rather than what textbooks say they should be capable of, and who designs every element of the battlefield to exploit the gap between expectation and reality. Tarleton expected Americans to break. Morgan built a battle where that very expectation became the mechanism of Tarleton's defeat. Daniel Morgan would not fight many more battles before the Revolutionary War ended. Illness and age began to catch him, limiting his ability to lead campaigns across the backcountry. But he never had to prove himself again. Cowpens proved everything that needed to be proven. A man with no formal military education, a man with scars on his back from British lashes, had defeated the British army at their own game. The myth of British military superiority, which had sustained the Crown's confidence through years of war, had been shattered on a frozen South Carolina meadow by a backwoods general and the ordinary men who believed in him. After Yorktown, after the war ended, and the United States existed as a nation, Morgan returned to his home in Virginia. He was given land as a reward for his service, something the poor teamster from the Shenandoah Valley would never have imagined as a young man. He lived out his remaining years respected, remembered, honored by the nation he had helped create. But his real legacy was not the land or the titles, or the official recognition. His real legacy was the lesson he had taught at Cowpens, that understanding your men, trusting their capabilities even when they are untrained, and designing your tactics around the actual strengths of those men rather than the theoretical requirements of military doctrine can overcome any advantage that an enemy believes they possess. That lesson has echoed through military history from that day to this. West Point teaches Cowpens. Military academies across the world study the battle. But the deeper lesson, the psychological understanding, the refusal to accept that his men were inferior simply because they were militia, the willingness to build a battle plan around actual human behavior rather than military theory, that lesson is less commonly taught and far more valuable. The backwoods general from Virginia, the man without formal training, the man who had been whipped by British soldiers and carried the scars for his entire life, had achieved something that military schools still teach because it touched something fundamental about what leadership means. Leadership is not about imposing your will on others. It is about understanding others deeply enough that they choose to move with you, to trust you, to follow you not because they must, but because they believe in what you are trying to accomplish. At Cowpens, that belief made the difference between victory and defeat. But here's what most people miss about Cowpens, and this matters more than the tactics themselves. The battle was not the end of Morgan's war. It was, in many ways, the beginning of something far more consequential. After the victory on that January morning, Morgan knew he had done something politically dangerous. He had crushed a British force, yes, but more than that, he had proven something to every militia unit in the Carolinas, that the British were not invincible, that they could be beaten, that British regulars could panic and run just as easily as Americans ever had. That knowledge spread like wildfire through the backcountry. Within weeks of Cowpens, recruitment increased across South Carolina and North Carolina. Men who had been uncertain, who had hedged their bets between the Crown and the Revolution, suddenly made a choice. They picked up their rifles and joined the militia units, following Morgan and Greene. The British command in the South understood immediately what had happened. They had expected Cornwallis to crush Morgan, scatter the rebels, and consolidate control. Instead, they had lost over 800 soldiers in less than an hour, and the American cause in the South had just been handed a second life. Cornwallis himself was furious. He burned his supply wagons and began moving north, chasing Greene and Morgan, hoping to catch them before the momentum shifted entirely. But he was already too late. The psychological tide had turned. What Morgan had understood, what he had built the entire Cowpens trap around, was not just a military principle. It was a truth about human nature under extreme pressure. When a man believes his leader knows what he is doing, when he trusts that the plan makes sense, when he has been told exactly what is expected of him and why, he will hold the line even when every instinct tells him to run. He will trust the retreat to the next position because the general told him there was a next position. He will believe in the discipline because the general believed in him first. That was the real victory at Cowpens. Before we continue deeper into what happened after this battle, I need you to hold something in your mind. The complete analysis of how Morgan constructed this psychological framework, the specific leadership signals, the language he used, the way he positioned reinforcements to catch breaking units, all of that is covered in exhaustive detail in our comprehensive military strategy guide. If you want to understand not just this battle, but how every effective commander from Alexander the Great to George Washington used the same foundational principles to transform ordinary soldiers into unbreakable units, that guide breaks it down signal by signal, principle by principle. You can find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It is the resource that goes far beyond what we can cover here, and it is worth your time if this topic resonates with you. Now, what most people do not know is what happened to Tarleton after Cowpens. The British cavalry commander, the man who had ridden into that field expecting an easy victory, spent the rest of the war trying to restore his reputation. He escaped the field himself and made it back to Cornwallis, with reports that contradicted what had actually happened. He blamed his troops for breaking. He blamed poor positioning. He blamed everything except the obvious truth, that he had been outmaneuvered by a backwoods general who understood something about his own soldiers that Tarleton, for all his British training and European military theory, had completely missed. Tarleton had believed that discipline and superior training were enough. Morgan had understood that understanding was more important than training. Knowing your men meant knowing what they could endure, what would break them, and what would hold them together. There is a detail that historians often skip over, but it haunted Tarleton for the rest of his life. After the battle, Morgan treated the British prisoners humanely. His men did not massacre the defeated soldiers. They did not take revenge for past atrocities that British and Loyalist forces had committed across the Carolinas. Instead, they gathered the wounded, cared for them, and held them as prisoners of war under the rules of military conduct. This restraint was itself a kind of message. It told every soldier in the southern colonies, British and American alike, that the American cause was not about rage or revenge. It was about something larger. It was about the possibility of a different kind of nation. Morgan understood something else that separated him from most commanders of his era. He knew that victory on a single battlefield, no matter how decisive, meant nothing if you lost the war. And he knew that you could not win a war against an enemy that had better supplies, better training, and better organization unless you won something else first. You had to win the minds of the people who lived in the territory you were fighting for. Every British prisoner treated with respect became a man who could tell others that the American army was not a mob of murderers. Every decision Morgan made after Cowpens reinforced what Cowpens itself had proven, that a different kind of military was possible. One based not on blind obedience, but on trust. Not on hierarchy imposed from above, but on leadership that had to be earned. In the months following Cowpens, Greene and Morgan continued to maneuver in the Carolinas. They never won a large set-piece battle again, but they did not have to. They had already won something more important. They had proved that the Continental Army could beat the British, and once that seed was planted in the minds of the Southern population, it was impossible to uproot. Cornwallis, frustrated and unable to catch Greene's army, eventually moved north toward Virginia and Yorktown. He was chasing an enemy that was no longer running. He was marching toward the moment that would end British control of America. And it all traced back to a single decision made by a backwoods general with scars on his back and a rifle in his hands. What happened at Yorktown in October 1781, 9 months after Cowpens, was the culmination of everything Morgan had set in motion. A French fleet appeared off the coast of Virginia, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route. Continental and militia forces closed in from the land side. The British general, who had ruled the South only months before, found himself surrounded and trapped. He surrendered on October 19, 1781. That surrender effectively ended major combat operations in the American Revolution. The war would drag on for another 2 years in the courts and through diplomatic channels, but Yorktown was the moment everyone knew America had won. Daniel Morgan did not command at Yorktown. By that point, his health had deteriorated. The wounds he had sustained throughout the war, the years of campaigning in brutal conditions, the personal losses he had endured were catching up with him. He retired from active command and eventually left the army. But every soldier who stood in those siege lines at Yorktown, every militia unit that held its position, carried within it the lessons learned at Cowpens. Morgan had taught them what they were capable of. He had shown them that they were not inferior to British regulars. He had given them the confidence that made Yorktown possible. Without Cowpens, Yorktown might never have happened. The real lesson of Daniel Morgan is not about military tactics. It is about something far more fundamental. Leadership, true leadership, is not about having the right answer. It is about understanding the people you are leading well enough to help them find the right answer within themselves. Morgan never tried to turn militia into regulars. He never pretended that farmers and riflemen could stand toe-to-toe with the British in open combat. Instead, he asked a different question. What are these men actually good at? What do they bring to the table? How can I position them so that their strengths matter and their weaknesses do not? The answer was Cowpens, and the world changed because one man in the backwoods of South Carolina understood his people better than his enemy understood war. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. This is what separates Daniel Morgan from every other commander of his era, and why West Point still teaches Cowpens in the same breath as Caney and Austerlitz. It was not the two-line formation. It was not the double envelopment. It was not even the brilliant reading of terrain or the perfect timing of the cavalry charge. Those were the tools. But the real genius, the thing that changed everything, was this. Morgan won because he refused to ask his men to be something they were not. He looked at a ragtag collection of militia and regulars, farmers and riflemen, and instead of seeing failure waiting to happen, he saw potential waiting to be unlocked. Most commanders see limitations as problems to be overcome by discipline or willpower. Morgan saw them as information. He took the weakness, militia breaking under pressure, and he turned it into the strength. Those breaks became the trap itself. The very thing that Tarleton expected, Morgan weaponized it. He knew that Green soldiers would run, so he built a formation where running was victory. He knew that militia could not stand in the open, so he never asked them to. Every decision Morgan made that morning came from a place of radical honesty about who his people were and what they were capable of achieving. Not in theory, not in some general's dream of what they could become with more training, but right there, in that moment, with the men he actually had. That understanding, that brutal, clear-eyed acceptance of reality, combined with the imagination to see how that reality could be turned into strength, that is what separates the good commanders from the great ones. Tarleton made a different choice. He looked at his enemy and saw only what they lacked. No professional training, no formal uniforms, no experience with bayonet charges. And he assumed that lack would translate to fear and collapse. He was not entirely wrong. The militia did break. They did run. But he never stopped to ask the deeper question. Why would Morgan position them there if he did not expect them to break? What happens next? What is the trap? This is the difference between studying warfare and understanding it. Tarleton had studied every manual. He had fought in every major engagement of the war. He had credentials and experience and the backing of the most powerful military in the world. But Morgan understood something that no amount of study can teach you. People are not chess pieces. They are human beings with fears and strengths and limits. And the moment you truly accept those limits instead of fighting against them, you can do things with those people that seem impossible to someone who is still trying to force them into a mold they were never made for. In the months after Cowpens, Cornwallis never recovered. His army lost faith. His reputation was damaged. Morgan's victory proved something that spread through the southern colonies like wildfire. The British could be beaten, not by a larger force, not by a better equipped army, but by a commander who understood his men well enough to turn their weaknesses into strengths. Greene used this momentum to methodically push Cornwallis north, harassing him, wearing him down, choosing the ground for every engagement. Within months, the British commander was forced to Yorktown, where Washington and the French completed what Morgan had started. The war in the South had turned. And it all began because one backwoods general asked a different question than every other officer in the Continental Army. After Cowpens, Morgan's health deteriorated rapidly. The years of hard campaigning, the musket ball wounds, the lash scars that never fully healed, they all caught up with him. He left the army in 1781, suffering from rheumatism and exhaustion. He returned to his home in Virginia and lived quietly, out of the public eye, while younger men took credit for victories that his tactical foundation had made possible. He died in 1802 at the age of 66, relatively unknown and certainly underappreciated. His farm was modest, his estate was modest, he never wrote memoirs, he never gave lectures at military academies, he was not invited to sit at the table with Washington and Jefferson and the other founding figures who would become the face of the Revolution. Morgan was a backwoods general. He had no formal education, he had the mark of the lash on his back. He did not fit the profile of the men who were building the new nation. And so history let him fade. But the tactical doctrine he invented at Cowpens did not fade. It survived. It was studied. It was refined. And it stands today as one of the clearest examples of what it means to lead people as they are, not as you wish them to be. The lesson Morgan left behind is not about formations or terrain or the mechanics of warfare. Any officer can learn those things from a manual. The lesson is about leadership itself. It is about the courage it takes to look at your people, really look at them, and accept what you see. Not with disappointment, not with resignation, but with creative intelligence. What do these men bring? What can they do better than anyone else? How can I organize reality so that their strengths become the decisive factor? This applies to far more than warfare. In business, in education, in any human endeavor where people must work together toward a goal, the instinct is usually to try to fix the weakness, to train away the flaw, to force people into a standard mold. Morgan proved that there is a better way. He proved that weakness, clearly understood, is just information waiting to be weaponized. The militia were not good at holding a line, so Morgan did not ask them to hold a line, he asked them to shoot and run. And the moment they did exactly what they were designed to do, the British army collapsed. That understanding that one man in the backwoods refused to pretend his militia were something they were not, and instead turned them into the deadliest fighting force on that field, that is why Daniel Morgan matters. That is why Cowpens matters. Not because it was a brilliant battle. Thousands of brilliant battles have been fought and forgotten. Cowpens matters because it was a lesson in human nature and leadership that we have been slow to learn and even slower to apply. 240 years later, and we are still trying to force people into molds that do not fit them. We are still disappointed when they fail to become what we insisted they become. We are still missing the Morgan insight. The secret is not to fix them. The secret is to understand them, and then to organize the world so that what they already are becomes exactly what you need them to be. This is what separates the commanders we remember from the ones we forget. This is what made Daniel Morgan a general without formal training, a backwoods rifleman, a man with the scars of a lash on his back, into one of the most important military minds of the American Revolution. And this is the lesson that his life and his victory at Cowpens left for all of us. The men and women you lead are not problems to be solved. They are people to be understood. And the moment you truly understand them, you can do things with them that seem impossible to everyone else. If this story resonated with you, if you understand why the leadership lesson Morgan taught us matters now as much as it did in 1781, I would deeply appreciate it if you would subscribe to Unbroken Regiment and leave a comment below telling me about a leader you have known who had this gift. Someone who understood you not as you wished to be, but as you actually were. Because those leaders are rare, and their stories deserve to be remembered and shared. The notification bell is right there. Turn it on, and you will never miss a new upload from this channel. Every week, We bring you the stories of forgotten commanders, overlooked soldiers, and the small moments of brilliance that changed the course of American history. Thank you for spending this time with us. We will see you next time. End of Part 4. Script complete.